Yeah. Well, and I think you and I were talking at one point, and you pointed out that exclusive homosexuality is a fairly recent phenomenon. You know,
Did I say that?
I think so. Well, it sounds good anyways. It sounds like something you'd say. So,
What did I mean by that?
well, basically, historically, homosexuals, in fact, I think until maybe the 19th century, there wasn't even a word for it. There was just a word for the behavior, which was called sodomy. But historically, homosexuals in a population have gotten married, they've reproduced, and then they've carried on these extramarital affairs on the side with same-sex partners. So this whole idea that we have today of these exclusive homosexuals in society, that didn't exist probably even 100 years ago.
Yeah, honestly, I know that, like, you know, Greece, they had some pretty open standards.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly how that worked. I know they had, like, mentoring, you know, things where it was involved in mentoring. But yeah, I think the idea of what we had talked about, if I recall right, was this kind of spectrum.
Yeah.
And you said there's a scale.
Yeah, the Kinsey scale.
That talks about, you know, how a person identifies and how they behave. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I remembered from that, and I had just kind of briefly looked into it, the thing that I recalled was the interesting difference between how people identified their sexual orientation versus what they were doing. Mm-hmm. So they would report, I'm having same-sex relationships, but I identify as a heterosexual. I consider myself heterosexual, but I also have these, you know, affairs with same-sex people.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they are confused. I think that they actually identify as heterosexual, but that they have same-sex relationships sometimes.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a big difference between what a person identifies as this is the thrust of what I normally am attracted to, mm-hmm. and yet, you know, yeah, I can deviate from that. And
well, and I think that until fairly recently, if you wanted a family, then, you know, there was this heterosexual path that you had to follow for that.
Yeah.
You know,
or you adopted a nephew.
Yeah,
or
something.
Him to your estate and raised him.
Yeah,
exactly.
But you know, until fairly recently, there wasn't this concept of, you know, gay and lesbian families.
Right.
That just didn't exist.
You had the confirmed bachelor and the old maid, and
right.
they did not have kids.
And
right.
those two guys, they're just roommates.
Right.
And so I think a lot of people said, hey, you know, I want these things, and, you know, I can get the sex part on the side, you know, with a willing partner. And in fact, there was a guy named Humphreys who did a really influential study, I think it was back in the 60s, and he published it in a book called Tea Room Trade. And if you've never read that book, that's really worth reading. But what he did was he went to tea rooms, which were public restrooms, where men who wanted to have anonymous sex with other men would frequent these restrooms.
And see, I would be thinking it would be like a place to get tea. I'd be like, oh, this is not what I thought at all.
Well, they were obviously public restrooms.
Yeah. Wow.
And so, anyway, he set himself up as the lookout in case the cops raided, because these things were frequently raided by police. And so he set himself up as the lookout, and the guys would come in and they would do whatever they did, and then unbeknownst to them, he was writing their license plate numbers down. And he ran their plate numbers through the DMV and got their addresses. And so, like, 6 months later, he showed up with a survey. And he was just doing some demographic research, and would they like to participate in a survey? And, of course, he was dressed totally different when he showed up at their door, and so they didn't recognize him as this guy that was in this tea room, and who pays attention to the lookout anyway, right? That's not what you're there for. So, anyway, so he gets demographic information. What he finds out is that most of these guys are heterosexuals, they have families, they have jobs, you know, and, you know, their attitudes on a lot of things are just indistinguishable from anyone else, but they have this other life.
Yeah.
And they go to these other places.
And I want to point out, I mean, I'm distinguishing in my head. I mean, I'm not claiming that there aren't people who get married in order to try to conform.
Right.
That they are really gay and they're getting married because they just don't want to be found out in society. I'm literally talking about the guy who says, yes, I'm married, I'm straight, or the woman that says I'm married, I'm straight, but I also have these same-sex relationships. Somebody that's openly acknowledging this and saying, this is how I identify.
Yeah.
But there's definitely people that I've known who, have a past life where they were pretending to be straight because they didn't want to deal with the prejudice, or because they were suppressing something that later they finally said, I can't suppress this anymore, I can't live like this anymore. And honestly, I just think that it's an absolute, I know it's not illegal, but in my mind, it's an absolute crime to ask people to live that way when what they're doing is really none of my business.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty benign thing for people, unless you're religious and you think that, or like these guys seem to have this underlying fear that if homosexuality increases unchecked, then you're going to threaten human existence.
And honestly, I want to point something out about those quotes. A lot of the email that we get that expresses these sorts of, I probably can't be kind to the statements, but that expresses these sorts of ideas, comes from atheists.
These guys are atheists.
I'm surprised, but I don't want to give away the wrong idea. These are atheist quotes.
These guys are atheists. Now, I don't know, interesting and disappointing as the quotes were on homosexuality, the quotes they had on murder were absolutely frightening. So, listen to this, okay? If murder is in someone's nature, how are they ethically or morally wrong? And again, this is that naturalistic fallacy because, if this is part of their nature, then it must be good, right? And so, the thing to remember here is that calling a behavior natural doesn't imply any kind of moral judgment on it. So, labeling it good or bad is a moral judgment that we apply after we assess its impact on us.
Right. And that's the thing. I remember on one of the programs that I saw on wild dogs, there was a female wild dog that started killing the pups. And I'm sure that for that dog, whatever she was doing was quite normal. Like that in her head, that was the thing to do, to go kill the pups. But, society doesn't have to accept behavior that threatens society. But the idea of a percentage of the population being homosexual is not the same as going out and killing babies. It's just not the same sort of threat. No one's coming into my home and invading anything of mine, threatening my property, people in my family. Nobody being gay is hurting me at all. And that's, I think, the big delineation is that they're trying to promote that this is a social ill. And it's really not a social ill. I guess what they're trying to express is, well, if everybody became gay, then we would just go extinct or something. Which and
they did express that concern. That
to be honest, I'm not that concerned about it. I mean, if people were to go extinct because they chose to go extinct, I mean, I guess that's our right as a species or something. I don't know. It's not like I'm promoting it or anything. I just wanted to say that, as far as as long as we're not committing genocide on one another and forcing each other to go extinct, if I'm just saying I don't want to have children, I don't really see how some heterosexual couple saying I don't want to have kids is any worse than someone being gay. Right. Why is it any less of a choice or less of a capacity? And what if somebody doesn't have maternal instincts for whatever reason? I mean, is that some crime?
Well, and I would say that if someone doesn't have maternal instincts and they know this up front, that's valuable information, and you should definitely not have children just because society expects you to.
Yeah, I think that's a really bad idea, in fact, to have kids because somebody else expects you to.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is I would see a huge difference between people saying, let's just go extinct, let's not have kids anymore, versus saying, let's start dropping nukes and just killing off all the humans on the planet. I mean, if you don't see some sort of delineation between us killing each other versus just saying, I'm not going to reproduce, then there's, I don't even know that there's some common enough ground to talk about it.
Yeah, and we were rapidly approaching this point with both of these guys, because, another quote was, You said that homosexuality is not maladaptive. Then neither is murder and nearly any sick attitude humans represent. So, and then finally, the last quote I want to point out with murder was the guy said, "I would point out that murder can be considered an application of the often mistaken maxim, survival of the fittest, or rather a perpetuation of evolution via natural selection, and thus is not in fact a detriment to society at all. While murder has more negative impact on a personal level, especially if you're the subject of that murder, the change to the gene pool which occurs can only be positive in terms of promoting valued traits and removing unfavorable traits." So essentially he's defending murder as a vehicle for evolution, as some type of natural selection.